Now, do you want me to kick off now? Is this
yes,
no sort of formal
Kwasi,
gong?
kick off.
Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. It's fantastic. A huge crowd, absolutely packed, and we've got an amazing panel. And they will speak a lot about themselves, I'm sure. But just
too much, I hope.
By way of introduction, Shashi Tharoor, brilliant writer, Indian politician, Maya Jasanoff from Harvard University, award-winning historian, one of the top imperial historians of her generation, without question. And Charles Allen, who's really a long-standing expert, commentator, extremely well-known figure in imperial affairs and imperial history, if you like. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'm going to see what our panel have to say about those questions. Now, I think I'm going to start with you, Shashi, not only because you're the one sitting nearest me, but you've created quite a stir with your book, Inglorious Empire. And as someone who has written a book called Ghosts of Empire, which is, funny enough, the title of this session, I wanted to ask you, why do you think, and we've both written books about the empire, but why do you think the empire continues to fascinate people? And why? And you got your own angle, which you can talk about later. But why, just first of all, why do you think this is a fascinating subject? Why are people interested in this?
Well, I think it fascinates some of us in the other side of the world, as it were, because the empire sort of sat on us and left its deep impress, as it were, for a very long time. And so because it's affected and shaped who we are, how we live, what our challenges are, and so on, it's impossible for us, I think, to be unaware of empire. I think it fascinates people in the former metropolitan power, largely because of ignorance, because they have absolutely no idea what they're fascinated about. There are YouGov polls which say that 59% of Brits think that the British Empire was a wonderful thing, and 49% would love to have it back. I mean, that makes my case mirror. They have no clue what it is they're actually glorying in. No clue about the oppression, the exploitation, the rape and pillage, the destruction of flourishing societies that accompanied this empire, which they see through rose-tinted spectacles in sort of gauzy television operas. And that, I'm afraid, is probably why there's still some lingering fascination for empire here.
Well, we'll get back to that. I just wanted to hear a Harvard
answer.
The other side of the world perspective. I'm sure it'll be balanced, but let's see.
Fair and balanced. You know whose slogan that is. I think fascination is an interesting word for you to choose, because fascination implies something sort of decorative and seductive and sort of, there's a little bit of a flirtatious quality to it, but I don't think fascination is at all the adjective that would be chosen, the noun that would be chosen by residents of former imperial lands. I think that I would second many of the answers that Shashi gave, but I would supplement it by saying that I think it's really important for us to be aware that imperialism is still with us. And that, all of this kind of talking about the British Empire by people in the former metropoles, is often detached from any sort of conception that this is still going on. And you need only, of course, to visit former imperial locations to be very aware of the impress of empire that it's left. But let us never forget that what is still going on in the world today are systems of exploitation, of often thinly legally veiled repression, and so on. And these are far from fascinating to the people who are caught up in them on the wrong sides.
Okay, Charles, you've got a very, two people on one side of the debate.
Yeah, and two on the other.
Well, I'm a moderator. I don't have a dog in this fight.
The British just a book. Let me say this. The British Empire is the greatest force for good the world has ever seen.
That's brilliant.
Who said that? Lord Curzon, okay? Statesman, politician, Viceroy of India, part-time historian. And I can think of other people exactly those qualifications, incidentally. One of whom is on this panel, incidentally.
So I think when we look at history, I think we really have to, first of all, look at empire. I totally, as Shashi's already said, 59% of people in this country think, the empire was a jolly good thing, and only 19% don't. And I'm, as you probably know, I'm what's called in India a topiwala. That's to say, of these four, I'm the only one who actually saw imperialism at first hand, but as part of the ruling caste. I was on, as you might say, the winning side. And so I saw it really at my father's feet. I saw him sitting on the bungalow, out of office hours, always accessible, and petitioners, one after the other, hearing the cases, and he could speak Assamese, he could speak Hindi, he could speak Bengali, he could speak some local tribal languages, and in that sense, he was very, very a good example of an administrator, perhaps the best that India's ever had in terms of a certain elite of educated people. Now, if I might then go on to say that he was also asked by Nehru to stay on, and actually stayed on until 1955. And so it's not as if you could argue it's because the British hadn't educated enough of their own administrators in the sense of actually learning the business. So clearly I came away with a very biased view that I thought the imperialism was a jolly good thing. A paternalist, yes. Benevolent, yes. But of course, that is not what imperialism is about. Imperialism is always about power. It's who holds the power. But I do want to say this. Imperialism is not some European pathology. It's not exclusive to Europe. And I'm going to quote one case because I think it's very striking. There's been some wonderful research in DNA, literally in the last 2 years. This is the largest survey of India ever conducted. And we now know that a very distinctive group of invaders came into India. Now, they didn't come with the British 2 centuries ago. They came 3,500 years ago. And they brought with them a DNA that was hitherto unknown in India. So they were definitely foreigners. And they came in and they dominated the local culture to the extent that they still dominate the local culture. And they were also very exploitative. We know that because actually the males were able to spread their seed and yet very widely across, and to the extent that the local men were not. And we know that because it survives to this day. And of course, we're talking about the Aryas. We're talking about the Aryas. So this is imperialism. And you can still see it because what they brought with them was Varna, which is basically a form of racism. And so let's just remember that imperialism is not of one sort. It actually comes in many colors.
Okay. I mean, those are very good points. I just wanted to pick up on one or two things and sort of focus the discussion. When you say imperialism is about power, to what extent, because of course one of the myths, if you like, of the British imperialism was that they would never ever say that. They would talk about the rule of law, they would talk about fair trials, they would talk about a sense of fairness, they would talk about cricket. I think Neil Ferguson, that was his great contribution to world scholarship, saying that cricket was I'm joking about Neil, he's a very good historian. But I just wanted to focus on the nature of British imperialism and your experience of it, and to see in what way was it different from Aryan invaders or Mongol hordes, if it was at all. I'll start with you because
myself. Okay. My own feeling is that it was based on exploitation, and I say I had to relearn my history. When I grew up, I had to relearn my history and realize that British imperialism has a very, very dark side to it. Indeed, you cannot get away from that. You can say, slavery occurs in every society through history. You can say that, it was the British liberals who were the first to actually oppose slavery. But we were also the ones who did best out of it, because we actually systematized it into a modern capitalist organization, making the most of the efficiency of the triangular Atlantic slave trade. And that dark stain is British imperialism. And we cannot do enough reparation, frankly, in quite a different reparation, incidentally, from the sort that Shashi wants.
What is the sort that you want? Let's get you in on that.
I want moral atonement. I've actually, in the debate, said that I'm not particularly interested in the money aspect, because how on earth do you quantify the value of the human lives lost? How do you quantify the enormous, intangible destruction of civilizations. What you can do, if it has to be monetary reparation, I suggested, is for the Brits to give £1 a year for the next 200 years to India, to constantly remind themselves of the wrong they'd done. But that's another matter. You know, I think moral atonement is the most useful thing. I think, first of all, I think Brits should learn a lot more unvarnished colonial history. I was shocked to discover that you can do A-levels in history from some of the most prestigious schools in this country and never learn a word, a line of colonial history. That has to change. I think that it's amazing that a city like London, which probably has more museums per square inch than any other place, has no museum to colonialism. Every museum is overflowing with stolen goods from empires, from the British Empire, and not... Chor bazaars are what they all are, as we would say in India. But the fact is that we don't actually have a museum that actually, the Germans can bus school children to Dachau and show them what their ancestors did in their name. There is no equivalent for a British school child to go and know about why the stool of the Ashantis is sitting in London and why the Kohinoor is adorning the Queen's crown in the Tower, and the whole legacy of exploitation, destruction, loot, drainage of resources, all of that helped build imperial Britain.
And Maya, do you think there should be a museum for sort of cultural or moral atonement that you described?
Well, I also want an apology. We haven't got to that yet. I would love to have a member of the royal family, since everything was done in the name of the crown, come to India. Next year is a perfect occasion, 13th of April, 2019, the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and apologize. That would be a very good thing.
What about your thoughts on this?
I think moral atonement is incredibly important. I think education is incredibly important. I live in a country, however, which obviously has its own very dark history with slavery, in which we learn about this a lot in school, and we still have racism. So I think that, I was struck at the 1807 bicentenary in Britain, and I thought, wow, there's all of this carrying on about, oh, look, we abolished the slave trade. And everyone was feeling really wonderfully morally superior about this without thinking about the fact that they had the slave trade to begin with, and that there was still slavery in 1833.
And when they abolished it, they compensated the slave owners, not the victims.
Exactly. So I think that, moral atonement it's a lovely idea, but I actually think that when you put money on it, it makes it it sticks a little more.
so let me get this straight. So are you asking for reparations?
I'm not asking for economic reparations, but I am asking, this is what I'm saying about imperialism is with us today. You asked, Kwasi, in your prompt, you said, Charles had said imperialism is all about power, but the British all talked about the rule of law and fair trials and so on. Well, guess what? The rule of law and trials and so on is an expression of power, right?
What is the alternative?
It's an organized form of power, no, but I think that we need to be aware of the ways in which, for example, the language of the civilizing mission, as was popularized and put into practice in the 19th century, made its way into current and ongoing conceptions of things like human rights, which obviously we support, but we need to be aware of the ways in which structures of injustice in, say, free trade systems, in which structures of injustice in, say, migration policy continue to make their way in the world today in languages that we may think of as morally superior, but still embed inequalities and systems of power.
In this case, the rule of law was applied with excessive attention to the skin color of the defendant.
Yes.
As I've described extensively, white people could get away with murdering Indians. There are only 3 instances in 250 years of British rule in India in which Englishmen were executed for murdering Indians, whereas there are hundreds, literally the other way around, for lesser offences. There's a lot of research showing that rule of law was hogwash.
So what about Charles?
I just wanted to come back to Shashi on this question of museums. We have a real quandary here. One of my bugbears is getting the British Museum, which is just completely redone its Asia section, to put in provenance, to actually say, where did these statues come from? And it's really interesting because a major part of the Hindu, particularly the Hindu collection, was actually collected by one man. His name's Charles Hindu Stewart. Somebody will know him famously as a character who would go down to the Ganga and do his pujas in the morning. And he collected all these statues. Now, where did he get them from? Well, a lot of them come from Bhubaneswar. and you think, oh my God, the British looting Bhubaneswar. What had happened in Bhubaneswar? The Marathas had been in and tore it to pieces. The city had been absolutely devastated. If you look at pictures from about the 1870s when first photography is being taking place, you can see the temple area, which is now beautifully cleaned by, bless the ASI, and indeed the authorities of Odisha. The fact is that it was ruination. And this guy was going around picking up statues and bringing them back. Now, we think that this is part of our heritage, I mean, part of your heritage. Everybody thinks what we see in museums is sort of a heritage, and we assume that everybody cares for these statues. But this is a new phenomenon. I mean, even in this country, we didn't start to look at the past with any idea of care until people like Stukely in about the middle of the 18th century. And so you do get these Orientalists who come out here, and I'm a great fan of the British Orientalists, who actually care about Indian culture and want to preserve it. And it is this new thinking that actually makes these museums possible. Now, again, we have this problem. We had the director of the British Museum going out to India lately and saying, look, we'd like to start giving some of this stuff back. This is all unofficial, by the way. Don't tell anybody outside this room. It's just...
I haven't heard about it.
And actually, the facilities are not there. You go to one or two places and the museums are on rack and ruin because there's no state, no government funding. So what are they going to do? Can they come to some arrangement of sending? So I think it's much more subtle. And this is my problem with Shashi's depiction of history. Simplification, sanitization. History is immensely, it's all about the gradations inside. And I don't think these sweeping judgments about murders or evidence is actually does history justice. It's a much more complex business than that.
Can I just, I thought that was interesting. And I just want to pick up on that before I open up the discussion. I mean, the danger here is that we're just going to go down a rabbit hole of self-lacerating, moral kind of indignation about the British Empire, and we could spend a whole hour recounting in gory detail all the crimes and abominations that were committed. I don't think that intellectually is very interesting or fair. I just want to ask you, before I open it up, do you think there was anything good about the British Empire? I mean, one thing.
Cricket, tea, and the English language.
Well, the English language is quite a big thing, okay. And well, we know Charles' position. Yeah, well,
I said cricket, tea, and
the English language. Questions, any contributions? You, sir, at the back.
Shashi, my question is addressed to you. How come my white English friends haven't forgiven Nazi Germany, but the Indians forgave Britain 1 or 2 years after independence?
Actually, 1 or 2 minutes after independence, to be honest. I mean, Nehru, for example, didn't want the Union Jack lowered at the time that the Indian flag went. We don't want to hurt the British. So there never was any bitterness. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that I recount in my book of Churchill some years later asking Nehru, how is it that after we imprisoned you for 11 years of your life, that you seem to bear no bitterness or recrimination towards us? And Nehru is said to have replied, I was taught by a great man, obviously Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate, which sort of was the animating spirit. In fact, even the language of independence was transfer of power. It was one lot of people leaving behind the Indian state for another lot of people, and a sense of continuity rather than of actually having defeated. I mean, when Charles was joking about the winning side and the losing side, the Indian nationalists, perhaps inspired by Gandhi, actually never spoke in those terms. It was merely a change. And there was this very Gandhian, very Hindu idea that you must hate the sin but not the sinner. And once the sin was over, there was no sinner left to hate. So there was never any hatred expressed against the British. My sort of, the burden of my song within India is forgive and forget's all very well. I think it's important to forgive because nurturing hatred is absolutely, it corrodes the hater far more than the object of hate. But you must not forget. So mine is a mission to prevent the forgetting while certainly applauding the forgiving.
Maya? On that? Very good. Maya, do you want to do that?
I was just, I've been puzzling over your choice of fascination still. I've been fascinated by it. And I was thinking about the fact that's come up already in this discussion, that we're living in a moment right now incredible polarization in terms of public discourse, where everyone on the one hand wants to denounce and on the other hand wants to celebrate, and it's it's a very kind of heated forum. And yet we're also living in a time, I think all of us can agree, of enormous fracturing and tension and difficulty. Well, might these things have something to do with each other? Might our inability to look at anything in sort of somewhat more nuanced terms or somewhat more informed terms actually help account for the collapse as opposed to the other way around? And I was thinking of the gentleman's question about Nazi Germany, about if you look, for example, in India right now, if you go into any bookshop, what do you see on the shelf? You see Mein Kampf for sale. It sells hundreds of thousands of copies every year in India. I saw it just the other day in a children's bookshop in Delhi. All right?
With illustrations? Or?
I didn't take it off the shelf. I didn't take it off the shelf. But what I want to say about this is that if you look at history from different points of view, you see very different goods and ills. And that this drive to denounce on the one hand, to praise on the other, is doing us, I think, irreparable harm at actually understanding legacies, systems, consequences, and ultimately difference, which is the characteristic feature of the world in which we live.
But Shashi, I mean, I think Maya's last comment really challenges you, if I may say so, because your book doesn't really do the nuanced thing in the way that she described. And what do you think about her comments?
No, you read the book and you'll see whether it doesn't really.
I've read the book a number of times. It doesn't do nuance that well.
Well,
or maybe it was me. I didn't see it.
Maybe it's the influence of Indian politics. We don't do much nuance in Indian politics, alas. No, look, I don't pretend to be a historian. I don't pretend to be a moralist. I'm there to make a point which I believe was in danger of being forgotten. Largely because there is a convenient historical amnesia, certainly in this country, and perhaps a more avoidable historical amnesia in other places too.
Sure.
And when I saw a series of books coming out in the first decade of the 21st century, Lawrence James, Andrew Roberts, of course Neil Ferguson himself with his Empire, extolling empire, and James actually saying in an echo of Curzon that the British Empire was the greatest example of benign altruism in all human history. I began to choke, and these are all best-selling books, and I said, for God's sake, somebody has to remind them there is another truth. So mine is very much an argument. It came out of a debate. I wasn't interested in nuance. I was very much interested in...
Which debate was that? Was that the one?
Oxford Union one.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, there was one that you and I featured.
That's right, and Willie as well.
And then Willie as well. So the fact is that... yes, it's an argument, it's not a narrative. I'm not trying to say, it may be this, it may be that, on the one hand this, on the one hand that. People can come up with the other hand. Mine is the one-handed sort of lawyer.
Okay. The one-handed historian. Any comments on that? You sir.
I think what I'm going to say is probably going to bring smiles on the faces of Mr. Tharoor and Charles.
Oh, yeah.
As Mr. Tharoor said, he's willing to forgive, but perhaps not forget. But I would go a step further and say, why not forget and look at the future? Because in the future, for example, India and Britain together can achieve so much that will benefit both UK and India, because for example, the trade between them, India needs technology, Britain needs a new market, and so why not think of that more?
Okay, so it's a very good question about whether we should or should not forget, because the future is actually what's really important. Whatever we remember about the past, we can't change it. Shouldn't we be looking to the future?
I not only don't disagree with that, I explicitly stated that at the time. As far as the importance of history in public discourse is concerned, I would say to young people, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? That's the significance of the past. But you must focus on the future. And I have said at the very beginning that everything I'm saying and writing now has no bearings on the present-day relationship with Britain, which is no longer the unequal one of a conqueror and the oppressed. It is of two equal sovereign powers, in fact, of comparable GDPs, which have certainly the possibility for future and present-day cooperation. And I have tried to stress that point. I've never been one of those who thought that you need to revenge yourself upon history. We've seen too much of that domestically in India, and I'm not referring to the Brits. I'm referring to those who wish to avenge temples destroyed 500 years ago and mosques built in their place and that sort of thing. And I keep saying this is wrong. Know about it, be aware of it, but today's descendants are not the cause of all those things. And the most important thing for us to do, it seems to me, is to realize that ultimately history is its own revenge. When you have Theresa May, the week after my book came out in India, then newly elected Prime Minister of Britain, coming not just to Delhi but to Bangalore and Bombay and Hyderabad, looking for investments from Indians in what was expected to be a faltering post-Brexit economy, that proved my point, right? I mean, there you have history as its own revenge.
I'm going to say that's
Charles, do you want to?
See, the irony is we're back to 1612 in this country, which is when East India Company merchants came begging, cap in hand, to the local Nawab of Surat. We've just been hearing about him. And we're back in that position. Yeah. And the irony, of course, is that perhaps in 100 years' time, we'll have people saying, these damn Indians, they've really screwed us with their enterprise.
We can start on the cricket field right away.
But I wanted to, it may seem odd that I should pay tribute to Shashi because he has actually written since this bizarre book here, which is a brilliant case for the prosecution, but it's not history. Anyway, Shashi has written the most important book to come out of India in recent years, and it's called Why I'm a Hindu. And I say that because here is a major public figure who stood up and challenged the revisionist history that's coming out of the, what you might call the right-wing Hindutva movement, which is trying to rewrite Indian history in terms of Hinduness. That is Hindutva, precisely. And it's incredibly dangerous. And it comes back to this simplification of history, which is why it's so dangerous, which is why, Shashi, I cannot really agree with a lot of what you've read.
Okay, there's a lady at the back who's straining to make herself heard, so...
One at the front as well. Huh?
Yeah.
It was very interesting, you saying that you were trying to return our looted Bhubaneswar things, and that we don't have sufficient exhibition spaces. As a curator, I know that isn't really true. However, be that aside, doing trade with Britain now, going ahead with being out of Brexit, what is the concept of neocolonialism, of the British still being in their own country but trying to control us and our education? Are we considering that at all?
That's what Maya really, I think.
Maya, do you want to remark about that?
Who's the us, just to clarify?
What is that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, excuse me, madam. Yeah, who is controlling whom? Sorry.
Right, who's controlling whom?
Your question.
The British.
Controlling
other countries like Africa, India, the West Indies, in their trade and in their education, in their foreign policies. There are very, very subtle nuances of neocolonialism here. Have we dealt with it?
So I think that it's rather flattering to the British to think that they're still controlling all of these other countries. I think that, I mean, as I've said, I think that neo-colonialism absolutely exists. I don't happen to think that the British are necessarily, have their fingers on the puppet strings, although the one place where, of course, this is still happening is the City of London. So let's think about that. I mean, what's interesting about legacies of imperialism is thinking about financial networks, right? Now, this is, of course, the kind of thing that Neil Ferguson thinks is the greatest thing that has ever happened in the world, and so let's support the British for doing that, but I think many of the rest of us see some of the malign consequences of it. The City of London was the great engine of imperialism, the great beneficiary of imperialism, and is now the great legatee of imperialism. And if we look at financial structures in the world today, we will see some of these forms of control. However, I don't think that we can simply leave out of the story all of the post-colonial backlash that has been, in many cases, very vibrant and important. And I think that one of the challenges in thinking about this question of blaming or praising the imperial legacies is also to think about what is now a good 70 years of post-colonial history in which the empire becomes a sort of proxy for present-day debates in post-colonial countries. And we need to think, I think, in somewhat more nuanced ways about how these how the empire is serving to sort of deflect sometimes some of the other sorts of debates that could be happening.
Okay, I'm going to take one question, and then I'm going to ask a question of my own after they've given their answers, and then I'll throw it up open again. Sir.
Yeah, what I want to get in as a historian is that I don't think it is particularly helpful to have diatribes or polemics about empire. A book which really impressed me very much was Maya Jasanoff's, one of your previous books, about collection and the borders in which Orientalists and other collectors stretched. And I think the point about empires were they were the default mode of governance across the world. The British Empire compares very favorably on ethics, on rule of law, on institutions with many others, including indigenous empires like the Mughals or colonial empires like the Spanish, Portuguese, or French. And I think we should celebrate the positive aspects of it, by all means be critical about inequalities, racism, and so on, which were certainly present. And I think we need a nuanced approach, which is about cultural exchange. I think, as Maya's books show, and as the best Orientalists have shown, there was a huge amount of cultural exchange. British Orientalists rediscovered India's classical heritage. It had been forgotten, buried. The language had been forgotten.
I'm going to be, that's great, that's great. So, Maya, do you want to get back in on that?
Hear, hear.
Well, he mentioned you explicitly. We have a convention in Parliament that if you're mentioned in a speech, you actually have a right to reply first. So, given that,
well, I'm very. Thank you for your remarks. I think, yeah. I mean, I think that, look, empires are the oldest form of government in world history, right? It is only. I mean, it's only really in the last 70 years that we have moved from a world of self-declared empires to a world of nation states. So when I keep talking about these legacies, what do I mean? What I mean is that this new world order, which is really, really new, is one that comes out of millennia of other forms of conceiving of state structures, of the relationship basically between geography, people, and power. And so the world of nation states that we live in is the heir to this imperial set of arrangements, and it's a very complex one. It's one in which, for example, as we know all too well from conflicts in the world today, the mapping of borders onto people is very uneven. It's awful. The mapping of power onto states and onto people is very uneven, hence the financial structures. So there are possibilities for, of course, exchanges across lines that you wouldn't expect. There are also possibilities, obviously, for collision and conflict within categories that we have now come to normalize. So let's not ever forget this incredible novelty of the world today. I think also as one of the reasons for the incredible turbulence, which I think we're witnessing in it right now.
Charles.
Some of you may know, I've been a great promoter of the Enlightenment, by which I do not necessarily mean the Buddha's enlightenment. I actually am talking about the age of reason. Although, ironically, there is actually something, there is a parallel here. We have this extraordinary situation in Magadha, which is one of the, now Bihar, in 5th century BCE, when a group of Kshatriyas started to challenge the Brahmin orthodoxy. And Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, Buddha Sakyamuni, founder of Buddhism, Gosala, and other leaders of the Ajivika movement, they challenged the system and said, hey, we've got to think for ourselves. And I know this sounds patronizing to say this, but countries get into a logjam of orthodoxy. And it happened in Europe in the Middle Ages, and the church and the kingship, and the whole idea of things you couldn't say and could say. And actually, these characters coming into India, they helped to break that logjam. And I know that sounds patronizing to say that people started to think for themselves. But I mean, that is what the definition of if we look at Kant, he says, you know, it's the time when mankind reached emancipated from a self of immaturity. And I know we think we're all modern, but we've only been modern for a couple of centuries in terms of challenging the fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury should be allowed to do this, whatever it is. This is a new way of thinking, and it actually helped, particularly in the Indian context, to really ginger up the Indian intellectuals, Ram Mohan Roy and the Bengali Renaissance and so on. And I know that sounds patronizing. Even the idea of liberty, the idea of democracy, countries need, and you could say, well, Hitler did the same when he invaded Poland. He probably woke the Poles up. And you're right, that is, invasion is always, it's not a nice thing. But I just think nuance again, nuance.
But can I put you on the spot? I mean, are you suggesting that they wouldn't have had those brilliant thoughts?
No, they would have had them. Of course they would have had them.
So if they would have had them, then what impact did it make?
Yeah. I'm just saying that suddenly you get a group of people coming in with new ideas, new way of thinking, new way of looking at the past, new way of looking at all institutions like religion, kingship, and actually saying, is this the best we can do? And you get brilliant, Shashi's from Kerala. Now there's some wonderful, the Brahmins were the greatest thinkers. I mean, their extraordinary capacity to come up with brilliant concepts. Now, the Nambudris in the 16th century invented algorithms, for heaven's sake, and they were great astronomers. They kept it to themselves. Nobody knew about it. The Brits come along and they translate these texts, and suddenly everybody realizes that actually it's the Indians who first invented algorithms and so on. And so this is how the exchange of information, these characters coming in and actually printing work that had been compartmentalized. The Brahmins, this wonderful language, which William Jones and others said was so fantastic, and of course we realize our links with in terms of culture. This was simply not available to people.
Charles, that's simply not. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be but you're 1,000 years out of date. Aryabhatta had come up with these theories, and the Arabs had discovered them and translated them. The work of Al-Khwarizmi in the 6th century, the 8th century, in which he explicitly referred to the Indian sources of his mathematical knowledge. Yeah. Algebra comes from India. The number zero, the whole concept of the decimal system was invented there. So there had been a lot.
We owe a lot to the Arabs too.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you and Maya and Zarir here about the importance of recognizing that our modern sensibilities and modern ways of political organization were not the default mode in the past, and I'm perfectly prepared to concede that point. But as an Indian, if I had to be the subject of an empire, I'd much rather it was an Indian empire than a British one.
Yes, of course.
Madam in the middle, and then you at the end. So.
As someone born and brought up in Britain and have faced abuse by people saying how ungrateful the Indians were to the British, I think it's facile to say now we shouldn't be bitter. And would you tell the Jews that they should forget about what happened in the 40s? Because what happened in India started 200 years ago, maybe in terms of the British, but it continued in the 20th century. And we do need to address that because we are a multicultural society.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair point. Absolutely.
The lady here,
thank you. I'd like to refer to Shashi's comments. I very substantially agree with Shashi, and I regard his work as very, very important in waking people up. There's being just this deliberate aversion of the gaze to uncomfortable truths. And I feel this is part of why there's so many mental health problems in this country. And I feel it's absolutely vital for this country, for the soul of this country, for the heart of this country, to face these truths. And I feel with Shashi's book that it's this dramatic wake-up call. And when you have countered this self-serving, in one sense, narrative, but actually sabotaging in another sense, which I'll get onto in a moment if I may, I feel once you've awoken people, as Shashi's work's helping to do, then one can start to get into the nuance which you've been referring to. So I feel, in a sense, both of you are correct in what you're saying. But if we look at the situation now, we may think the past is the past, but I know Indians who will not trade with Britain because of the colonial past, who will not send their children here. It's an invisible barrier to trade. I'm a member of the Institute of Directors, and I feel all this work needs to go into the business community because people are
Can we have a shorter comment?
they're going naively into India looking to trade without understanding all the nuances, which are, both of you are touching on. It's vital. And if we look at the situation with...
Madam, I'm going to have to...
May I just briefly...
Roll it up, sorry.
If you look at Prime Minister Modi, he paid a state visit to the Republic of Ireland before he paid a state visit to here. It was clearly one in the eye to Britain. There was a blackout in the British media.
Okay,
but this
Forgive
shows...
me, madam.
Yes.
I've got only 20 minutes.
Yes, sure.
And lots of people want
Sure.
to contribute. And you've done maybe 3 minutes. So thank you very much. Madam at the back, a question, a short question.
Yes.
I don't want speeches.
No, I don't want to give a speech either. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name on the end.
Charlie.
It's Charlie. Hi. I sort of agree with you, and I think it's great that you talk about the Brahmins and the amazing brains that people had, and that the British went along and sort of helped them to think about these things. But
Question, please. We've got to have a lot more discipline, please.
I didn't have time to think with the question, but anyway, I've been looking at Japan and modernity and the exchange of culture and ideas and the Enlightenment. And the Japanese didn't have to be invaded to think about these things. They actually sent out their people, their intellectuals to America and Europe, and so did the Iranians, and so did the Ottoman Empire, blah, blah, blah. So I just want to ask, do you recognize that? That people were doing this without the British going over?
You don't need to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized to acquire modernity. She's right.
That's a very, very valid point, absolutely.
Can I just... lots of people have lots and lots of ideas. Could I please...
That's a good point, absolutely.
Plead with you not to have 3-minute, 4-minute speeches. We want short, sharp questions so that we get our wonderful panelists to interact with what you have to say.
Quick comment that the British Museum curator once told me that the British Museum has never in its history ever deaccessionized an item. That is, they will never, ever give back anything. So the idea of them searching and looking for places to give back to is not correct.
Well, I think it was an exchange of temporary loans is what they were talking about. This is what they're talking about. So it becomes temporary.
We will lend you what we stole from your grandfather.
Okay.
It's the protectorate model.
Let's play a game here. Only put up your hand if you've actually got a question. I don't want statements. I don't want speeches. Just questions. Have you got a question? Then please, great.
Do you agree with me there?
No, can I just ask if my brother can comment on all this?
Your brother? Oh, your brother. Okay, madam in the red, in the middle.
Thank you. I was just wondering what the panel make of the recent campaigns to discuss whether statues should be taken down, statues of the ghosts of empire, so Nelson and Rhodes. And can we have a nuanced discussion when there are still statues of these ghosts of empire in our cities?
That's a fantastic question. So there's a debate in Britain at the moment about particularly Cecil Rhodes, and someone else has mentioned Nelson's column. They should be ripped down because of the awful things that they did in their lives, and it was wrong to celebrate those careers in that way with a statue. What do you think about that, Charles?
I think it's like saying let's hide all traces of Auschwitz. I know that sounds an extreme case. I mean, these guys did. I mean, Bristol is the one that I feel closest to. Because, Bristol's wealth comes from the slave trade. There's no doubt about it. And here's this great benefactor who's remembered all over the damn place. But if you tear it down, does that mean people forget? I mean, leave Rhodes there, but put up a damn great plaque saying, this guy, yes, of course he does Rhodes Scholars and this and that, but he marched all over Lesotho land and actually... was actually the worst possible kind of rapacious exploiter. So if we forget, that's crazy.
Look, I'd love because Maya, coming from Harvard, will have your own slant on this because my understanding was that there were Southern slaveholders. Maybe that was Princeton, who gave money to the university. And
well, that was all institutions in the United States, I think. Sure. Yeah. So no, I mean, look, I think that the idea that we can wipe out the past, that we should wipe out the past, that we can only focus on the future without looking at the past is nonsense. So that is a scary road to go down. That said, there is a huge difference between celebrating a certain kind of legacy and acknowledging it. And I believe that we must acknowledge these legacies. We do not need to celebrate them. So here's a proposal which fits with Shashi's idea for moral atonement. The proposal is, let's set up a statue park in Hyde Park. Let's have, near the Albert Memorial, actually, we could do it. How about that? We take the statues of Rhodes and various other figures. I was walking down Portland Place last night. It was statue after statue of grandees of imperial massacres. So let's put them in a statue park. Let's make it into a museum of empire. And then in the places where the statues are removed, let's have a plaque. Let's say what was there. Let's say why it was there. And let's make sure that even in the site it is not forgotten, but it is not celebrated.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You want a quick word on this?
My quick word is actually, to my own surprise, I must have agreed more with Charles than Maya, because I think that actually the statues tell us far more about the times in which they were erected. That's right. And the attitudes of those who erected them. What I would like would be corrective. I mean, I would love to have a statue of an African slave directly opposite the Rhodes statue, ideally facing it.
Good idea.
I would love to have, a statue of a starving Bengali peasant facing Churchill down outside.
We've got that at 5:30. Just hold your fire on that. Yeah, Maya, just one quick
further comment. I've been talking a lot about imperialism is still with us. Look, Oxbridge has recently come out with these shocking statistics of the number of Black, Asian, Middle Eastern students let in. What does it mean when you are a student going to these colleges, especially from backgrounds that don't traditionally go to these colleges, and you walk in and there is Cecil Rhodes on the front? I don't think that having a Black slave on the other side of the street is going to make you feel a lot better about walking into that gate with Cecil Rhodes.
Okay, again, I want to put your feet to the fire on this. Would you rip those statues down?
I would move them somewhere else.
Okay.
And
we have done in Delhi what Maya recommends. We've created a thing called Coronation Park, where all the statues of British imperial grandees have been moved. It's unfortunately in a sort of very shrub-ridden, desolate corner of the outsides of Delhi.
That's not true.
And the pigeons are usually
They're the main beneficiaries, are they?
It's rather wonderful.
Okay,
and it was the site of the Durbar.
it was the site of the imperial Durbar, which is why it
It's a
was
wonderful
chosen.
irony there.
Have we got a microphone? We've got a lady here, I'm afraid, who's coming in. Okay, so I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to work back.
Well, okay, I'm not an historian. I don't claim to be somebody who's very well read. I have a simple question to you. And that is, if the imperial times were so great and the empire was so great. No, just let me finish, please. Well, why isn't the general public here in England taught anything about it? They're so ignorant. There were 3 series last year at the BBC about the partition. And since I said to you before that I'm a general member of the public, we get to hear comments of, was it like this? Did it happen like this? This is from the members of the public around us, and I say they're the educated British. So why aren't the British taught about it?
Well, can I just make one point about partition? I was always amazed also to find in India a kind of silence about not talking about partition. And it's only now that people really are talking about it, it seems to me. Am I wrong in saying that? Okay, no, I'm obviously wrong to say that. I felt that there was like...
That was not a popular intervention.
Oh.
No. Anyway, this gentleman at the back wants to contribute.
Yeah, Kwasi, earlier in your earlier discourse, you highlighted the fact about reparation. I take a nuanced view about colonialism and empire, in that everybody tried it, the Spanish, the French, just that the British were the most successful at it. However, in the case of the reparation, why should it be that students from the empire come up here and pay overseas student fees? Isn't a form of reparation as easy as letting them pay home student fees? Because when I studied there, I paid overseas student fees. I'm from the Caribbean. So shouldn't we be paying like the similar...
Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
I have 2 letters. Answer your question. The EU. That's the... That's
no, it's not... No. Kwasi, no. I'll go back to one thing, because the EU, it was Margaret Thatcher who used the vehicle of the EU to promote globalization for boyfriend Reagan. Okay, I'll give you an example. Right, Kwasi? I'll give you an example.
We'll move on.
I'll give you an example. Just look at the banana industry. The banana industry, my parents had big farms in the Caribbean. And if you look at the banana industry, a banana stem, have hands. Out of 14 hands in a stem, say sometimes 8 were rejected and 6 came on the gizboat. Okay, so François Mitterrand almost refused to veto, or he tried to veto EU's WTO agreement, the Lomé Convention, because he wanted goods from his...
Again, I'm going to have to do what I did to the lady
so,
here. We've got to move on. We've got a very short time. Let's talk about reparations.
The question is to Shashi.
Okay, let's talk about reparations.
What do you think of some form of reparation to students or young people from the empire coming to study in the UK?
Great.
I think that's actually a terrific idea. We won't call it reparations, but there could be a scholarship for children of the victims of empire, where they could all come and study for free and raise the tone of the place in the process. I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
It's probably impossible to administer, though, but I like the thought.
We've absorbed a lot of time. I'm literally going to take one more question from the floor, which I hope is a question. I will go to I'll go to the panel, and then I will ask the panel to sum up their thoughts. Okay, so one more question. There's one man at the back here. So, are you? Okay, good.
For young people in Britain as well as in India, whatever, would you recommend any books, any reading? For the three of you, what do you think I should be reading to understand this history?
Okay, it's a good question.
Apart from the book that you're discussing.
Absolutely.
I don't admire.
That's your answer. That's your answer. Okay, on that, there's a very, very quick question, a very quick answer. So I'll give you one more. This woman is straining in the middle with a hoops top.
It's specifically about partition. My grandfather is still alive and in Canada, and he was one of many who moved over from Pakistan to India. And I saw him in October last year. He specifically asked me never to forget and never to forgive until we get an apology. How likely are we to get one?
Well, I honestly don't know, because we're not the ones doing the apologizing, we're the ones seeking the apology. The first time I floated this idea, which was about a year and a half ago, a little over a year ago, I was told by a very, very senior Brit, whom I cannot name because it was a private conversation, it's not going to fly, because if we apologize to you lot, we'll have to apologize to 130 different countries. But I met the same gentleman several months later, and he said, you know, we're thinking about it, which was a long way forward. Now, I don't know how it's going to work out. It's a difficult call. It's certainly difficult for a politician to swallow, because when a politician comes and apologizes, there is a loss of face and possibly a loss of votes. And that's why I said, you know, a member of the royal family might be in many ways, because everything was done in the name of the crown. And perhaps somebody could come and just say, we're terribly sorry about, I mean, as I said, the venue and the date suggest themselves very obviously. Because Jallianwala Bagh were not by any means the worst in terms of numbers. The British killed 100,000 in Delhi in putting down the so-called mutiny of 1858. But it was in many ways the worst for all sorts of other reasons. The betrayal of promises made during the First World War, the ingratitude for the enormous contributions and sacrifices by Indian soldiers and the Indian public, the hypocrisy of the imposition of the Rowlatt Acts, then the shooting, the cold-blooded massacre itself, the indifference to Indian suffering afterwards, the way the bodies were, the dead and the dying were left for 24 hours in the hot sun, and people were not allowed to even give water to their dying loved ones. The racism of making Indians crawl on a street on their bellies like worms, at the end of which the self-justification with the collection being raised to reward the massacrer. And that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, hailing him as the man who saved India and the sort of... That entire package, you've got 25, today's money, the equivalent of £250,000 sterling, with a bejeweled sword.
He was sacked
without a pension. Yeah, well, I don't think he needed a pension.
Okay, we don't want to relive.
Long story short, that occasion, the centenary of that moment, because that collectively made it symbolic of all the worst atrocities of the Raj. If on that occasion somebody from the royal family would like to come and say sorry, I think it'll go a long way towards cleansing the soul, as it were, of the sin of empire.
Look, so I'm just going to ask a question.
You'll send Meghan Markle, will you?
I'm just... No. I was thinking of her, actually. That would be quite an innovation. But look, I just wanted to say, I mean, you've all written fantastic books. You've all expressed yourself very clearly and with great passion on this subject. I just wanted to ask, what did you think was, in all your researches and your writing, what was the strangest thing? What was the strangest thing, the thing that surprised you most, if you like, about writing your book, Shashi? I kind of think I know what you're going to say, but let's just see.
No, I started off, I must say, with a point of view. And I think what surprised me about the research was how much worse things actually were.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to...
It really...
I wish I could prove it. That was exactly what I thought you were going to say.
For example, I didn't know that... I hadn't read the research about the rule of law. I hadn't read Fielding's accounts of the... and you know, this is supposed to be a liberal Englishman recently retired from the Indian Civil Service. His autobiographical accounts of the Indian Civil Service and the very deep racism and contempt for Indians that animated the empire. I hadn't been completely prepared for the abominable way in which the sort of Indians who were brought into the ICS as window dressing were treated. I wasn't prepared for the astonishingly blatant salary disparities, in every respect. The extent to which racism was central to the empire came as a bit of a shock because I grew up in a post-independent India and I'd never met English people directly with that sort of inferiority complex in my head. But to think of what they could do and had done for 200 years to my people and my country, that was truly shaking. And then, of course, the numbers. I mean, the extraordinary, the fact that a country with 1.8% of global GDP came and took over, gradually in stages, a country that at that point had 27% of global GDP and managed to reduce it to a poster child for third world poverty. It really was quite an extraordinary story. And all of these things, eventually, I didn't know, for example, that Britain owes 2 prime ministers to 1 Indian diamond. The Pitt diamond, which was taken from Madras in 1702, sold to the Duke d'Orléans, and the resultant fortune bought the Pitt family a manor in the countryside, a seat in Parliament, and gave you both the Earl of Chatham and the other William Pitt. So all of these things, there's an account I came across by Walpole, just taking a carriage down the street and counting the number of wonderful marbled mansions that had been built with Indian money. This is in the late 1700s. All of which people are unaware of, and I was relatively unaware of. So it really, I think it sort of opened my eyes before I set about trying to open others.
Maya.
So I think there's a kind of research that people do which confirms that they were right. And then there's a kind of research...
Right enough.
It's made, absolutely.
that people do that sort of makes them wonder what's going on in the world. And I think all of my work has been that. I come from a country which is built on the idea of anti-imperialism. It's a country that is built on the idea that monarchy is tyranny, that democracy is the way forward, that all men, and now we'll even say women, are equal, and so on. And yet, of course, I come from a country in which the latter is far from true, and in which we are, these days, the great neo-imperial power, albeit sliding in the face of others. So for me, the study of history, the study of the history of empires, is a study in... it sounds, you know, reductive in a way to say, but it is a study in complexity, right? It is a study in the coexistence of these kinds of ways of thinking. The ways of thinking that whereby you can believe in the rule of law and yet perpetrate all of the crimes that Shashi says. A kind of society in which you can advocate for technological change, industrialization, et cetera, while at the same time immiserating and impoverishing large sections of the world. And these are the kinds of systems in which all of us as individuals live. It is a country in which, it is a world in which, for example, my country goes out and does things in the world of which I am, in certain respects, the beneficiary, even as I forcefully disagree with much of what it does. So I come away from my study of history with a sense of humility and with a sense of the challenges that face individuals and groups in advocating for what we think is right in a landscape in which there are many competing forces and sedimented traditions and institutions that make it very hard for us to find our way.
That's fantastic. And the last word goes to the only experiencer of imperialism.
But it's more,
as part of the winning side.
It's more than that. It's been my blessing to have been able to wander around India for 60 years as a young adult, almost 60 years anyway, and to been received with unfailing kindness every time, never to have any violence or words said against me. I've been arrested a few times, but that's a different issue. In one occasion, they've always been incredibly kind when I was arrested, and it was for crossing borders and things like that. So it was fairly safe. But I've always, and I'm very conscious that there are two Indias. I belong to an organization called Dalit Watch, and I'm very conscious that when we talk about history, we talk about us, the privileged. And I'm very conscious that in India, for all the injustices that the Brits did there are greater injustices that are still being perpetrated there in the name of caste, and also, if I may say so, in the name of sex. In terms of, I was researching the Cholas, the great imperial Cholas, wonderful temples and statuary, in many cases we know donated by the queens of the Cholas. What are their names? They're called the mother of such and such a king, the daughter of such and such a king, these nameless people who don't play any part in history. So I come away with a kind of very nuanced sense of history that's not being told here. And we can go on about imperialism, these quite superficial things. Underneath it all, there are other cruelties going on. And I find that increasingly important in my old age. Can I end with a message?
Yeah, sure.
My greatest teacher has been Romila Thapa. Now, she's the victim of much abuse by the right wing at the moment. They call her a communist and a secularist and a stooge of Congress, wherever it is. And she actually begins her lectures in a way that I now do. I'm talking to students. She said, be very cynical, and this is my advice to you when you look at any history book. All historians, when they put out theories, have an axe to grind and a political message. So always ask yourself, what is the political message of this historian you might be reading? So don't believe a word any of us have said, basically.